Legend has it that the impregnable city of Troy only fell when its citizens were tricked. Fooled into bringing inside their gates a giant wooden horse that concealed in its belly enemy troops. Today, the term Trojan horse is a byword for deception.
The Trojan horse is the enemy within, the gift that you shouldn't accept, the gift that really turns out to be poison.
The ancient Greek poem which gave us the story is the oldest and one of the greatest in all literature.
It's got everything: a beautiful heroine, sex, revenge, violence, and a tragic ending.
But could this be more than just a story? Did the Trojan horse actually exist? Now experts are looking for proof that the ancient Greeks had the capacity to build such an extraordinary object. They're investigating claims that the Trojan horse was in fact a piece of revolutionary weaponry.
They would have had to run a gauntlet right up to the gate.
They'll test radical theories as to what caused the destruction of Troy. Was it really a marauding Greek army?
They butchered every single adult male.
Or could it have been a natural disaster?
An earthquake will inflict a great deal of damage.
This is a forensic investigation to try and finally solve the Trojan horse mystery. The tale of Troy begins with a Greek queen and one of the great love triangles in history.
Helen of Troy, the Spartan queen whose face launched 1,000 ships, the most beautiful woman in the world, who ran away to Troy with the Trojan prince.
According to the Trojans, she left willingly. According to the Greeks, she was kidnapped.
The dispute over Helen is the cue for a vast Greek army to sail to war against the Trojans.
It was an expedition of revenge, an expedition of loot, an expedition of glory against Troy.
This story was first set down 28 centuries ago in the works of the poet Homer. He describes how after a 9-year siege, the Greeks came up with a ploy to finally crack the city's formidable defenses.
The Greek army would pretend to leave, but it would leave behind a beautiful wooden horse.
This is the part that the movies tend to focus on.
The Trojans, to their peril, accept the horse inside the city.
That night, the Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse sneak out. They open the gates, let the invading army in, and the city is wiped out. For most people today, this epic tale is just that, a work of fiction.
The whole cycle of stories about Troy is almost always assumed just to be a myth.
But is there any truth to the legend? Classics professor Edith Hall studies Homer's texts and has long doubted the accepted view. Why couldn't there have been a Trojan War?
And if the war took place, then maybe the ancient story of the Trojan horse had some historical reality behind it as well. I want to find out whether there was any real history behind that myth, and in particular, whether there was any real history behind the Trojan horse.
Retired military engineer Stephen Ressler will approach the problem from a different standpoint.
What I'm going to do is engineer the conquest of Troy. I'm going to use a series of computer models to examine the ways that the conquest might have happened from an engineering perspective.
By combining cutting-edge experimentation with forensic analysis of the ancient texts, our experts will set out to answer some fundamental questions. Did the Greeks and the Trojans really fight over Troy? How did that war end? Ultimately, they want to find the truth behind the tale of the wooden horse. The first step is to prove that Homer was describing a real place, that the city of Troy existed, and that it really was an almost impregnable fortress. In this, the texts are clear about where we ought to look. Homer's poems say that Troy stood by the Aegean Sea, that the gods could watch the battle from the mountains of Ida, and that the Greeks brought up supplies from what are now called the Dardanelles. Connect those points, and the evidence leads to one corner of modern-day Turkey. Here, archaeologists have excavated a 50-acre site that dates back 4,000 years. At first, all they found was a walled citadel. Later, the discovery of a much larger city beneath showed it was big enough to be Homer's Troy. Now, archaeologists want to use these ruins to find out the truth about the Trojan horse. They need to establish if this could have been the location for Homer's epic.
Then, to secure the camp and naval powers, they raised embattled walls with lofty towers. From space to space were ample gates around for passing chariots, and a trench profound.
Homer describes a city whose walls could not be breached. Military historian Mark Schwartz wants to know how the real Troy was defended. He starts on the edge of its lower city. So far, very little of this vast area has been excavated.
This would have been filled with houses. Lots of activity going on in the streets. You know, sort of the everyday hustle and bustle of life in a very active merchant city.
For Schwartz, the task is to build a mental picture of what an attacking army would have faced as they approached. It's clear that stone walls were not the only obstacle.
Okay, so this is old excavation unit, and you can see just down there, that's the remains of that fortification ditch. That was about 2 meters deep and 3 to 4 meters wide. It would have run the length of the entire lower city, about 2 kilometers around.
While it may not seem impressive, that simple ditch would have been highly effective. And it's the first sign that the Trojans made serious preparations against attack. The entire lower city was ringed by a defensive ditch, and inside that, a wooden palisade. This modern storm drain has very similar dimensions.
So this was a serious impediment to most of the army, to the chariots, to the infantry, to any sort of equipment they're trying to bring across. They can't just climb in and climb out. It's not that easy. In fact, it's difficult. Imagine trying to do it with a full set of bronze armor. And you're being shot at. This is essentially a form of attrition. It's a way of slowing down the army and making sure that the attackers accrue a lot of losses on the way. And that basically discourages them from a further attack.
But it's also just the first line.
If the Greeks actually got through that line of defense, they would have the entire lower city to get through, to get up to the citadel. Street fighting, basically, urban combat. It would have been a pretty tough slog.
The sense is slowly emerging that this was a city designed for war, one that would only be captured at a great and terrible cost. But if an epic conflict had taken place here between the Trojans and the Greeks, what could have caused it? In her quest to unravel the truth behind the Trojan Horse mystery, classicist Edith Hall travels to northwest Turkey to the site of historic Troy. The stories say it was about honor, that 1,000 Greek ships came to bring back the Greek queen Helen. But could there be other, more practical reasons for an army to invade? Hall has come to see firsthand the landscapes of Homer's literature.
I feel as though I'm walking straight into the 13th century BC. I feel like a time traveler.
Being on the ground confirms what the few surviving historical sources suggest. That this mound of rock, less than half a mile from the sea, was the key to the balance of power in the entire region.
This is the northeast bastion of Troy, and it's from here that you can get a real sense of the setting, the amazing strategic location of the city. It's at the very crossroads of east and west. This is where the coast of Asia meets the sea. It's where Greeks would first arrive if they want to come up into the Black Sea. Whoever had this place had the control of the Dardanelles and the whole of the Bosporus, could control the whole of the trade into the Black Sea, and was basically the conduit, the channel for all kinds of communications between Western Europe and Asia.
Troy's importance wasn't just strategic. It had a reputation throughout the region as a city of wealth and luxury.
The Greeks, anyway, thought that the Trojans had a very, very, very luxurious standard of living.
So this is not your basic little run-of-the-mill cow town. This is a major, prosperous city.
The Trojans were traders, and they were particularly famous for one commodity: horses. Horse bones found in the archaeological record show that at a time when they were still scarce elsewhere, these prized beasts were plentiful in Troy.
One of the words that Homer uses for Troy is, though, that it has very wide avenues, wide streets. They wanted to be able to drive their horses and their wagons and their chariots actually within the city walls. So obsessed with their horses were they.
Horses were also a symbol of the power of Troy because horse breeding and horse dealing was such an important part of the Trojan economy.
And in the time Homer writes about, horses had a clear military value.
The horse, in the form of the chariot, was a war animal. Horses might also be a gift that one king would give to another. It would be a very high-end, very luxury item.
Seen in this light, it starts to make sense that the Greeks might choose a symbolic horse to trick the Trojans. And with its wealth, trade, and vital strategic position, it's clear that Troy was worth fighting for. But what evidence is there that the city was sacked in the way Homer describes? Generations of archaeologists have scoured these ruins, trying to identify when these walls fell and what caused their collapse. What damage is simply down to time, and what is deliberate?
What I want to find is evidence of destruction, such as tilted walls and things off kilter, even cracked blocks, things that wouldn't happen naturally. And in fact, this huge piece should not have this crack right through the middle. You can actually see where it's broken in half right here. In fact, there's quite a lot of little details around the site just like that.
Klein consults with retired military engineer Stephen J. Ressler.
The damage is quite unique in that it's a series of very clear fractures that are oriented on a diagonal. But the rocks are simply fractured. They're not pulverized or broken into small pieces. This certainly does not look like the result of an attack on the walls of Troy.
Whatever created this damage was a force far more powerful than any ancient weapon.
Then the father of the gods thundered terribly from on high, and from beneath did Poseidon cause the vast earth to quake, and the high peaks of the mountains, and the city of the Trojans.
Even Homer tells us that the city was shaken by what he calls the wrath of the gods. Could it be that what destroyed Troy wasn't a war at all? According to the poet Homer, the city of Troy in modern-day Turkey was wiped out by the ancient Greek army. But a closer reading of Homer's words suggests another possibility. That Troy was destroyed by a natural disaster. Eric Klein travels almost 500 kilometers from Troy to Istanbul's seismic monitoring station to check out this theory.
How are you? Nice to meet you.
From the 19th century till now, more than 90,000 people lost their lives because of the earthquake in Turkey.
That's equivalent to a dozen Troys. The ancient city sits on the edge of a major fault line. It seems that the most likely cause of the damage that Klein found was a quake, or even a series of quakes.
Today, we know why earthquakes take place with plate tectonics, and we know the science behind it. But in antiquity, they would have thought the gods were angry and the earth was shaking because of the gods.
Even as Klein stands watching, reports come in of a new quake, originating just a few kilometers from the ancient city of Troy.
There was an earthquake 1 minute and 40 seconds ago in the region of Çanakkale, right near Troy. We've just been in this area, in the region of northwest Anatolia, and we're talking about earthquakes in antiquity, and here one has happened just now in that very same location. In the end, we can surmise that there were really destructive earthquakes in the late Bronze Age, and that we should expect to find some indication of that while excavating.
Seismologists agree that a series of quakes may well have hit Troy around 1300 BC. But here the mystery deepens. Homer's War took place around 1180 BC, fully 100 years after the earthquake hit Troy. And it seems that instead of fleeing, the local people flocked here and rebuilt the city, populating it more densely than ever.
You've got strong masonry of the one city, the one that was destroyed, but there's almost an immediate rebuilding. So we're looking here at the end of one of the big houses of the previous city. But now we've got a new addition, which has been added after the earthquake. So obviously there were survivors, they have rebuilt, they've done new additions.
Klein spots a difference in the quality of the craftsmanship.
But things have changed a bit. This is not quite as nice masonry as it is in the big house. It's on a different level. The big mansions of the previous city now seem to have smaller interior party walls put in, almost as if there's 3 families living there where one family had been before.
Evidence found in the rebuilt Troy suggests that its citizens were facing a new threat, not from earthquakes, but from a human enemy beyond their walls. Excavations have uncovered dozens of huge storage jars sunk into the ground beneath the citadel. They are there to stockpile food supplies.
That would have enabled them to survive within the protection of the city for a longer period of time than had been the case earlier.
This could all be suggestions that people are gearing up for a war.
These are the actions of a people expecting to be besieged. And the defenses of Troy hold crucial clues that further the investigation.
Parts of the fortification walls were thrown down by the earthquake, and so there was a need to rebuild quickly.
But the walls weren't just rebuilt, they were strengthened.
A new tower was added on the southeast side of the city. One of the gates leading to the citadel was blocked so that there were fewer entrances to the citadel.
Each of these steps made Troy harder to take.
So this is Fortress Troy.
Military historian Mark Schwartz puts himself in the position of the defending troops, manning the citadel walls.
335 meters of this very, very solidly built wall. This looks imposing as it is, but it would have been double this height. And you can see it's about 4 meters wide in places. So you could actually get a number of defenders up here, hurling stones, shooting arrows, right, at anyone who's attacking the city. And they're also covering their weak places.
Troy's weak points are its 3 principal gates. We know that after the earthquake, the western gate was sealed. The eastern gate was fortified with a second outer wall to funnel attackers into a narrow kill zone. Then, a large tower dominated the approach from the lower city.
So what do? They have towers projecting from the wall. Defenders on top of this tower, which is a little bit higher than the wall, can shoot back while defenders on top of the wall are shooting down. And so you get any attacker right in a crossfire right there.
The fortifications were clearly well thought out, but Homer is equally clear that they fell.
Soon should our arms with just success be found, and Troy's proud walls lie smoking on the ground.
From amongst these formidable defenses, archaeological clues have emerged to suggest that an enemy force did somehow get inside the walls.
What has been found there is approximately a meter of earth, very blackened with bits of charcoal, within which some arrowheads have been found.
This suggests that the city was taken, that it was burnt, that this time it was not quickly rebuilt.
So clearly there was an attack. Who the attackers were has always been a question.
Many see this evidence as persuasive. It matches Homer's time frame and points directly to a Greek assault.
One of these arrowheads is of a type found only on the Greek mainland.
The city that seems to have been destroyed by an earthquake eventually recovered. It was rebuilt. And this city seems to have been destroyed by humans.
And while few bodies have been recovered from this time, to Barry Strauss, the way they were left tells a brutal story.
The excavators have found an unburied male skeleton outside the door of a building on the citadel. Perhaps it was a householder trying to defend his home. Most dramatically, they found the skeleton of a 15-year-old girl buried in the lower city. And ancient people would not bury a body within the walls unless they were under very great stress.
For some scholars, looking at the written evidence and the archaeology, there is a clear case to be made. That the Trojan War and the sacking of the city aren't myth, but historical fact.
I'm convinced that the Greeks were at war with the residents of this part of Western Turkey all through the Bronze Age. The ancient Greeks in the 8th century BC produced an incredibly detailed account of a war that had taken place about 500 years before, rich in all kinds of detail about the Bronze Age that I don't think they could have necessarily have invented.
If Homer is reliable about the Trojan War, could his story of the horse also be rooted in fact?
What an extraordinary thing great Odysseus achieved in the carved horse, in which all the chieftains were sitting, waiting to bring death and fate to the Trojans.
And when the Trojans pulled this carved horse into their city, the chieftains jumped out and opened the gates for the rest of the Greek army. Today, some scholars believe Homer's tale is a mythologized version of the truth. Perhaps the carved horse was something else entirely. What if it wasn't a statue, but a weapon? And the downfall of Troy was brought about by a practical device, like a battering ram. Mark Schwartz looks at the feasibility of this strategy. He starts at the city gates.
This is the south gate, the main gate to the citadel.
Troy's gates would have been wooden and the obvious points to attack. So if the Greeks got close enough, how would a ram have worked?
A battering ram is, at its simplest, it's just a big log with something sharp or heavy at the end of it. And you're just using the weight and the momentum behind this big log to get in and smash a gate such as this one.
It'd be more effective if it had metal at one end, and sometimes the metal was shaped to look like a ram's head, hence giving it the name, the battering ram.
The theory is simple, but how does it stand up to scrutiny?
I was a combat engineer specifically, and combat engineers specialize in both construction and destruction of obstacle systems.
Former military engineer Stephen Ressler places himself in the position of his ancient counterparts.
I'm particularly fascinated with ancient engineering because of the conditions under which the ancient engineers operated. They worked in a world of much greater constraint. They had very limited materials and very limited tools to do their work.
Applying those limitations, Ressler constructs a virtual model of a ram that the Greeks had the technology to build.
I'm incorporating a chassis made up of wooden timbers with 4 wheels, wooden wheels that's structurally robust enough to support a ram consisting of a tree trunk that probably weighed about 1.5 tons to 2 tons.
It could be wheeled up to the gates. The ram itself would swing on ropes so that gravity could drive the impact. Each blow would be 10 times more effective than simply charging the gate with a fixed ram. It's exactly the same principle as a modern wrecking ball. But deploying a ram in battle conditions would be uniquely difficult.
It would have taken hours to approach the walls of Troy and then to deploy the ram and to batter down the doorway.
They would probably assemble the battering ram outside of the range of arrow fire. But obviously, once they got within range, and they'd have to in order to get it up to the gate, they would be under constant attack.
In skilled hands, a Bronze Age bow is accurate and lethal at more than 50 meters.
And so they would have had to run a gauntlet to get right up to the gate. You're essentially being funneled right into a death trap right here.
The doorway might have been knocked down in the matter of 15 minutes of continuous operation, but they would have been subjected to considerable defensive fire from the battlements above during that period of time.
And so you would have had to try to bang and slam right into this gate, really with all of these attackers from here, from there. I would not like to have been in that situation at all.
My suspicion is that the machine never would have had an opportunity to go into action. I think it probably would have been destroyed before it reached its target.
If Ressler's suspicions are correct, then a battering ram couldn't have been an alternative to Homer's Trojan Horse. In this scenario, the Trojan War would soon reach a stalemate, and the only option for the Greeks would be to begin a siege, which according to Homer lasted 9 years.
Now 9 long years of mighty Jove are run, since first the labours of this war begun.
Troy's defenses were perfectly suited to withstand an assault. But how could the Trojans themselves survive a lengthy blockade? Mark Schwartz looks for evidence below the surface.
So this is the ancient water system of Troy, and this was what allowed the citizens of Troy to actually survive the siege, because you can go maybe a few weeks without food, but only a few days without water. So they actually constructed this beautiful system of shafts to supply water to the citizens. Wow, that is incredible.
The earth below Troy hides a natural spring. That's one of the reasons why the city stands here. Over a period of centuries, the water's flow was controlled and directed via channels, cut by hand through the bedrock.
You can see the chisel marks. Maybe they took a natural path and then enlarged it. And originally the water would have been filling this.
The network spreads out underneath the citadel.
You can see this vertical shaft going right up to the surface. And that allowed access to this water system. And another shaft down here.
Out of reach today, but at the end of this opening is a vast man-made central reservoir. It was capable of holding more than 1 million liters of drinking water.
These shafts are like the veins and arteries of the city, in the fact that they provide the life to the city.
Homer tells us that the Trojans survived 9 years under siege. The archaeology suggests that was entirely possible. But Homer also tells us, and the archaeology supports the idea, that the downfall of the city did come. There is one last extraordinary explanation as to what the real Trojan horse might have been. Legend has it that Greek soldiers hidden inside a wooden horse brought about the fall of Troy. Modern scholars believe the ancient Greeks might have built another combative device to breach the city's defenses. In the centuries after the siege of Troy, siege towers would become an accepted part of warfare. What if Homer's writings are actually a veiled description of the first time one was used?
It is certainly plausible that the whole idea of a Trojan horse is a dim memory or even a metaphor for some sort of siege tower. I mean, a siege tower would have had men inside of it. It would have been covered with animal skins, and it's not such a far leap to get from a siege tower to a Trojan horse.
All the historical accounts we have of these devices date from slightly later, but there's nothing in their construction that the Greeks couldn't have achieved.
Well, in its simplest form, a siege tower really is nothing more than a mobile ladder that's designed to get assault troops up to the level of the enemy battlements with some level of protection.
Taking Troy's fortifications into account, Ressler designs a machine. 5 stories tall, 25 tons of wood. Capable of holding 200 men, but requiring hundreds more to push and pull it into place.
You can imagine the chaos that would have been a battle such as this. You would have to launch everything you had at that wall. You would have had to have your men all along here, your archers, your slingers back there, giving you covering fire, shooting at those defenders, trying to suppress their fire on you. And then you'd have to wheel slowly that tower into place.
One of the best clues that such technology did exist at the time of the Trojan War is to be found in the city walls themselves.
It seems clear that the Trojans were aware of siege warfare. There is no other reason to make their walls at an angle rather than straight up and down.
This simple fact was a massive barrier to the siege tower's success.
The wall's angled about 20 degrees here. If you think of it like this, you're actually going to have quite a bit of space between the top of the wall and the top of the siege tower. And somehow, under full fire from defenders, you're going to have to get men up that siege tower, up and over onto the wall.
And that means that the tower must be equipped with some sort of drawbridge that will allow assault troops to be able to bridge that gap. The drawbridge itself would be a fairly sophisticated structure in order to be able to carry those loads safely. So we can see that there's a fairly substantial challenge in designing a siege tower to attack the walls of Troy.
Mark Schwartz has serious doubts that it would have worked.
Given the losses they would have incurred, given the angle of the walls, given the difficulty in getting from the top of the siege tower over onto the tops of the walls, given the limitations on the available archers and slingers they might have had, it would have been very unlikely that such an attack would have been successful.
Having ruled out the possibility that the Trojan horse was any kind of assault weapon, the experts have to return to Homer's writing. And the idea that the Greeks found a radical way to end the siege, not with brute force, but with guile.
Unite and rouse the sons of Greece to arms, but with caution try what yet they dare.
The Greeks celebrated cunning intelligence. They told each other lots of stories about trickster heroes and people who managed to steal things or win wars by tricks.
The story of the Trojan horse is as plausible a history as any other speculation that scholars have come up with. Why don't we do Homer the credit of really listening to what he says?
According to the stories, the ruse works like this. The Greeks assemble a group of heavily armed, hand-picked warriors. They're loaded inside a giant horse which is left outside the gates of Troy. The Greek army appears to sail away, abandoning the siege. They're actually hidden, shielded from view by an island just off the shore. What follows has been represented countless times in story, art, and film. The horse is taken inside the gates, and the Trojans let their guard down as they celebrate the war's apparent end. The Greek soldiers inside the horse sneak out and throw open the city gates. With every other theory discounted, one last possibility remains: that the horse Homer writes of did exist. But how plausible is this scenario? First, why a horse? Perhaps the animal's connection with Troy made it a logical choice.
It would have been a fine symbol that the Greeks had left, because the horse was one of the symbols of Troy. So for the Greeks to leave a horse was a token of submission.
How would they have built such a complex structure? Stephen Ressler believes that there's a clear answer to this, rooted in the fact that the Greeks of the late Bronze Age were seafarers.
We know the Greeks were great shipbuilders. So if they were going to build a large wooden horse, I have to believe that they would have built it the same way they built their ships.
The seafaring Greeks had been honing their carpentry skills for centuries.
Well, first, in the overall framework of the horse, we have a keel below, just as a Greek ship would have. We have the prow, which corresponds to the prow of a ship. We have a stern post corresponding to the stern post of the ship. The body of the horse very closely resembles the hull of a ship. And I truly believe that's the way it would have been put together. It had to be able to carry fairly substantial loads.
Those loads being a number of armed troops. But just how many warriors might there be? The Trojan horse is a story that's literally grown with the telling. Later accounts suggesting that it held virtually a full ship's company.
From the mythology, the most common number we hear is 30. So let's start by assuming there were 30 men inside the horse's belly.
A warrior in full armor would require more than 2 cubic meters of space.
Here's my model of a single man seated, and in order to investigate how much space 30 of them would require, all I have to do is copy him 29 times.
They can be arranged in a number of ways, some more efficient than others.
And so we can look at an alternate arrangement of men seated in 2 groupings, one above the other inside the belly of the horse. And in this case, it's a considerably more efficient arrangement. Not only can we fit 30 in, we can actually fit 40.
The result is a massive structure, the enormous statue beloved of Hollywood.
If I take this model and scale it up to meet the proportions of a full horse, it turns out that the height of the Trojan horse would need to be a little bit over 10 meters tall. That's equivalent to the height of the walls of Troy themselves. And indeed, a horse that large would have weighed upwards of 30 metric tons.
Clearly, a smaller horse would be more practical. And for the trick to work, the Greeks only needed to conceal enough men to open the gates.
I think 9 elite warriors inside the horse constitutes a strike force that was entirely adequate to their mission, which was simply to get the gates of the city open.
With that in mind, he adjusts his model. It would need to be small enough to appear unthreatening.
The horse is actually quite modest in size. In fact, I suggest that if you were a Trojan, you might actually be surprised that it could conceal 9 men inside.
It's a little over 4 meters tall and less than 2 meters wide.
I've designed my Trojan horse to be small enough to fit inside the south gate of Troy.
Homer tells us they used a Trojan horse to get in by hiding their men inside this huge wooden animal.
Could the Greeks really have tricked their way in like this?
I frankly would be surprised if the Trojans would fall for that. At the very least, I would want to knock and say, anybody there?
How plausible is it? That's difficult to say. But the idea of getting infiltrating forces in the city in order to gain access to the gate and open it to the rest of the army is plausible.
We can imagine that there was a debate. Do you think the Greeks have really gone? Do you trust the Greeks or not?
Another group, though, said, no, this is a gift from the gods and that we ought to take it in and welcome it.
What follows in Homer is that the horse does go through the gate, and the siege reaches its bloody end.
And the Greeks inside the horse open the gates of the city. The Greeks enter and they are able to slaughter their opponents. The Trojans mount what little resistance they can, but in the end, it's not enough. The Greeks finally, after all this time, take Troy, kill its royalty, and sack the city.
The scale of the brutality that was needed to take a city of this size and sophistication was breathtaking. Homer's description of the sacking of Troy is very graphic and very violent. It comes in the mouth of Priam, the king of Troy, who actually foretells his daughters being raped, his sons being put to the sword, the little children being thrown off the walls of Troy, the whole place gutted.
By the end of the day, there would have been nothing left of Troy but a smoking ruin.
Homer's Troy fell more than 3,000 years ago. As the ancient city has been covered with physical layers of stone and earth, so a chain of real events has been obscured by layers of myth-making. And yet it's hard to reject the entire story as a fiction.
In my opinion, the Trojan War took place. I think Troy was a wealthy city. I think it took quite a while to capture.
We know that the walls of Troy would frustrate almost any attack.
They tried one thing after another. In the end, they had no choice but to try deception.
Any assault would have required men and resources far beyond what was available, while the Trojans, for their part, appear to have been ready to withstand a long siege. Having taken all of these scenarios into account, the essential truth of the Trojan Horse story, a trick, a cunning act of deception, may look like the most plausible answer.
Of course, we start out by saying, this can't possibly be true. It's so simple-minded. And yet, sometimes simple-minded things turn out to be true.
Homer tells us that the stalemate in the war could only be broken with the Trojan horse.
It's a jolly plausible account, resonant with history.
And if Homer was right about Troy and the Trojan War, maybe his description of the fall of Troy is also true.
Once you've used the Trojan horse, no one is going to fall for that again. But if this was the one time it was used, it might even have succeeded.
Expert opinion on the accuracy of the Trojan Horse story is divided. But the fact that it's now legendary doesn't mean it's just a legend.